Hey everyone, my name is Kasperanza, and in this video, I wanted to talk about why Ayn Rand demonized Kant, and I think it's a very interesting philosophical battle and disagreement, probably the most interesting one because I used to be an objectivist. Ayn Rand got me into philosophy, and in many ways, I consider myself a Kantian now, but I still very much value and love Ayn Rand and her philosophy. So that's what I want to talk about today. Why did she demonize Kant and not Marx? Uh, and I have a few videos. So here's a video. Um,
Today you're supposed to apologize to every naked savage anywhere on the globe because you are more prosperous. Well, he hasn't and doesn't intend to. Why are we being told? Because the ruling philosopher today in Harvard and everywhere else is Immanuel Kant. And that's the real villain of our age. It's not Karl Marx.
You mean he's the one, huh?
He is the one.
Kant is the one. Okay.
It's not Karl Marx and it's not even religion. So I do not approve of religion, as you know. But those are not the villains. The villains is Immanuel Kant, who preached that man's mind is not valid, that the things you perceive are not there, they're not real.
so yeah, I think it's really interesting that she attacks Kant and not Marx or Nietzsche or anything. And she also says that after Kant, that's when philosophy really started to go downhill. And it makes sense. Like, and I do kind of agree with her that after Kant, the transcendental German idealist philosophers, I think, kind of really lost it, like Schopenhauer and his pessimism, and Nietzsche and his aristocratic philosophy, where he seemed to be an apologist for dictators and like Napoleon, and why Nietzsche is often um, mistakenly conflated with Nazism, and why Marx was actually, even though I agree with his alienation of labor in a sense, um, Marx and Hegel took a kind of very collectivist attitude that did not take the individual rights of human beings seriously. So I think Ayn Rand is right that philosophy today kind of has really lost its Enlightenment values and principles. And Kant actually, in my opinion, was an Enlightenment thinker, and he saved the Enlightenment. But the people after him, right, the German philosophers after him, went past Kant and didn't take him seriously enough. I think that's where the problems came in. So, but Ayn Rand is right to see him as the apex. But I think, Ayn Rand called Kant a villain. And I think it's really interesting. Like, in my philosophy, right, I study monsters. And if you find yourself demonizing someone or turning someone into a villain or something like that, there's a couple of things. The first thing is that it means that you have a lot in common with this person. And it also means that this person is showing you the way forward. As I guess, I mean, I put this down here in my monster epistemology, but the people we demonize tend to be very similar to us, and they show us the way forward. And I think Ayn Rand would have been a much greater philosopher. And in many ways, I feel like I am carrying the conversation forward by making this video, by kind of going back to Kant and trying to make sense of him as an ex-objectivist, as someone who used to be an objectivist. So the reason why Kant is so important is because I think he kind of revived the Platonic problem, or he started to really, I mean, he exposed the limits of reason. And obviously, if you're Ayn Rand, here's some more quotes. And it's interesting, again, why did she demonize Kant is because she said that Kant's philosophy is the exact opposite of objectivism. And if you're someone who is, into like astrology or spirituality, or even just, one thing you start to discover is that opposites are very, very similar to each other. There's usually something about them that links them together. And both Kant and Rand valued rationality. They were both Enlightenment thinkers. So I just think they went about rationality in completely different directions, but they still valued rationality, which is why I think Ayn Rand, in many ways, is as important as Immanuel Kant. But it's interesting how the problem with Ayn Rand is that she took things for face value, literally. Like when she looked out into the world with her philosophy, she saw objects as they are, and that objects as they are just what they are, and you can know them rationally. But Kant is saying you can't exactly know things as they are, and this is where he creates the split between the phenomenal and the noumenal worlds. But let's get more into specifics about how Rand's philosophy isn't actually, like, why does it not work? What is wrong with it? What's missing? The first thing is when we carve up reality, we're essentially, there's a lot of different layers and levels to reality, and I'm really struggling to explain this, but when we carve up reality into objects, what we choose to create, how we create those objects, is basically our language. Language defines our reality. And objectivism doesn't realize that when objectivists carve their reality into objects, it's just one language, and that they assume that their language is the only language, when there's actually many ways that you can carve reality. And just because you have a concept for something doesn't make it perfect. And this leads me to my next point. Even if you do have a language, and if everyone agreed on that language, concepts are constantly breaking out of their categories. So, for example, if you have if you take this Godzilla thermos, for example, which is really cool, I got it for Christmas, people can agree on what this object is. It's a thermos, and with a thermos comes with all of its traits and qualities, where, it holds liquid, and it keeps your coffee warm if you pour coffee into it, and it has a Godzilla pattern on it. But even then, this object is still changing. It's not just a thermos in your head. It's becoming its own thing. It changes. It's going to decay. It's going to transform. It's going to break. Ayn Rand assumes that objects are what they are, that A is A, and that's true, but this mug isn't, it's not what it was 2 seconds ago or 3 seconds ago. It is still changing in some sense. And you might be like, well, what are you talking about? That this is the same as it was before. But all of reality is like this. It's changing, and the categories are breaking. That just because we grasp something with our minds does not necessarily mean that we've grasped reality. We've only grasped a percentage or a part of it, and that's what Kant is saying. And I guess, right, Ayn Rand sees it as, that famous quote where she says, because man has ears, he is deaf. Because he has eyes, he cannot see. I'm not sure where she said that exactly. I think she said it down here. I'll just type it. Eyes. Yeah. Consciousness is not valid. Man is blind because he has eyes, deaf because he has ears, deluded because he has a mind. And I think she's taking Kant too far. I don't think that's what Kant is saying. Kant is saying that he's injecting humility into the philosophical conversation. He's showing us the limits of reason, and this is why like Rand and Kant are both similar, but the fundamental difference between them is that Rand just assumes reason can figure it out, while Kant is saying there are limits to this, and why Kant is taken seriously philosophically is because Locke and Hume were already pointing this out in the sense that when we carve reality, when we try to capture reality, there's a problem here. Reality is changing, and even when reality is changing, even when we categorize things, we disagree on categories and how we define objects. If you look today at the transgender stuff, what is a male and what is a female? People are disagreeing about that. It's because reality can be interpreted in different ways. So, and then on top of it, there's other things. A lot of the time when we define objects, they're defined by our reality and urges. I mean, not our reality, but our drives. Like, why do we define human beings as male and female? A lot of it is because we want to have sex and procreate. So, or like, why do I define this as a thermos and have a definition of a thermos? It's because this object is seen for me so I can drink my coffee in the morning. It's not seen as like a rock or a stone or something else. And I don't carve up my reality in a different way. I carve it in a way because this, and Jordan Peterson has made this argument, and in a sense, Jordan Peterson is still relevant and kind of important, and he shouldn't be just dismissed, but like, this is, we define things. I mean, Freud talked about this. I think Nietzsche talked about this. Like, our sexual impulses, our drives, our will to power, we create our reality based on what we want, based on what we're looking for, not necessarily what's true or objective. It's about like, how do I get what I want because I want it? So people tend to this is where you get different knowledges and different kinds of power structures and different values, right? Our values determine what we see. What we value and what we care about don't always get us towards the truth. We create the truth that we want to see. And anyway, so I realize objectivists are totally disagreeing with this and they would not like this at all. But this is why Rand hated Immanuel Kant, because and it's weird because I feel like Kant saved reason, because Hume and Locke were talking about this, and then Kant was like, okay, well, there's the phenomenal world that works pretty well. But then there's the other world, there's the noumenal world, there's things in themselves that we don't actually know, right? We don't actually know this in itself. And there's this really cool article called Untethered in the Platonic Realm, where this writer, Johannes Jaeger, this is why most of philosophy, that famous quote where I can't remember who said it, but some guy said that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, and it's because Plato pointed out with his perfect forms this fundamental philosophical question. This problem is that how do the concepts in our head map onto reality in the right way? And how do we truly grasp reality? And this is why objectivists often say that Kant is a continuation of Plato. But let's see. So, I don't know, it's just a good article. I'm not really sure, but it kind of just pointed out that there's this constant dialogue, this back and forth between the map of reality in our head and the actual reality, right? The concepts in our mind and the phenomena in the actual world. And like, how do we carve up reality? I mean, Jordan Peterson has a really good video where he talks about autism and I'll get to that later because I think Kant and Rand are both autistic in a sense, or they're more on the autistic spectrum. But they talk about the complexity of the world and how these abstractions, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to carve up reality and to break up reality, and how do you decide which carvations to go off of? And based on those concepts and those carvations, you can get totally different understandings of how to navigate in the world. And this is why I think Kant is so important, is because it's like, well, we're limited here. We can only carve up the world so well and grasp the world so well before, like, we have to accept that we just don't know. So again, I think Kant is bringing us back down to, he's humbling us. He's injecting humility, while Rand is just kind of assuming Rand is taking a very pride and just like, I know reality as it is. So if you still haven't like agreed with me, if you don't know what I'm saying, I like to think of objectivism as it's very, very similar to object-oriented programming or object metaphysics. Before I started accounting, and I graduated as an accountant, so that's cool. But before that, I was studying computer science. I was learning about object-oriented programming. And as I was learning about it, I made the connection that it was very, very similar to objectivist epistemology. That like when you build a program in object-oriented programming, you're literally creating objects in the program. You create different methods and different different attributes and traits for actual objects, right? You're treating the program as a bunch of objects interacting with each other rather than just the program running, which is very, very similar to objectivist. Again, it's similar to objectivist metaphysics. And I even found this article by this guy, by Adam Reed, and he basically makes this argument. He points out all of the connections. Like, the object class in object-oriented programming is like the concept in objectivist epistemology. An object instance is the same as a unit, and the method of an object is a potential action. And then, so you can kind of just go all the way down the, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Why is it highlighting? That's, so anyway, so you can just see the direct connection. And like, I saw the same thing, like he's arguing the same thing, but so, and what's also interesting is that Ayn Rand came up with her objectivist epistemology the same time object-oriented programming started to become a thing. So both of them came up, like both of these fields arose like at the same time. They both sprung up at around the same time when human beings needed to like map out reality. And so I guess a lot of objectivists are probably saying, well, this is why objectivism is correct. This is literally how computer scientists think, right? But I would actually argue this is why objectivism is wrong. This is exactly why objectivism doesn't work, because of the fact that it treats reality as a program. Objectivists treat reality as a simulated reality. They don't treat reality as it is. They treat reality as objects that they constructed onto reality. And it reminds me of how, like, you know, like when a programmer is building objects, they're missing, when they create the program, they're literally building a simulated reality. They're building a total, like they're building an alternative reality, which is fine, but, and it's a very good way to build programs and to think about reality and to and to model reality, but it's not the actual reality. And I remember watching a video by Jonas Cheka, and he talked about how video games don't age or decay. And because they don't age or decay, it shows you how programs are not the actual reality. That, and this is why objectivist metaphysics is incorrect, because they mistake real reality for a program that they build in their head. And I also remember talking to someone a long time ago. I was arguing with them about whether or not Ayn Rand was correct or not, and he said that Ayn Rand's philosophy was like, it's as if everything is frozen in time. Reality doesn't transform. Reality doesn't change. It's like freezing reality in time and then carving it up and then saying this is objective reality. But it doesn't take into consideration that reality changes, that the phenomena, that the carvations that you carved change. And this is why it's very similar to a program, because objectivists have to keep recarving reality to fit the changes of that reality. So it's like a camera, you know. You know how when you run a program, it takes like, you know, 0.000 whatever seconds for that program to run, or however, I don't know. When I used to study programming, you could measure how long it took the program to run itself. But it's just interesting because every time you run the program, right, it would reset. The program would always run in a very predictable way. The objects would always interact based on how you defined the objects, not based on how the objects actually are, but based on your own conception of the objects. So just listen to what Jonas Cheka says.
This was a popular online multiplayer game, but over the years became almost completely abandoned. If Worlds was a material structure, it would be falling into ruins, but its digital nature prevents it from ever decaying. A structure that cannot decay is a structure that cannot provide space for new structures. The eerie result is an architecture that is clearly outdated but unchanging, dragging behind the present. A world stuck in time.
Right, and this is exactly what objectivist metaphysics is like. It's a frozen metaphysics. It's a very rigid metaphysics. It's a metaphysics that doesn't allow for change. And it's very similar to, I mean, there's so many different connections, right? Like it's so interesting how, like, objectivism is like object-oriented programming. And if you build a program, it's like an architecture frozen in time. And then I talked to that guy a long time ago who basically said objectivism is like freezing reality. And then on top of that, if you think about building a program, right, you're like Prometheus or Frankenstein. You know that book, Frankenstein, where the scientist Victor Frankenstein makes a monster? The Frankenstein monster is showing you what happens when your rationality, when your reason doesn't... this is why Frankenstein is like the ultimate argument against objectivism, and why it connects so well to what I'm talking about, because it shows you what happens when the scientist or the creator or the person who is using his reason to understand reality doesn't capture all of reality. Because when a program doesn't work, right, we call that a bug. And there's a lot of bugging. In fact, like 20% of the time you're writing code, but when you're editing code and debugging, that's 80%. So 80% of the time you're just making sure that your program runs smoothly. And when it doesn't, we call it a bug. But in the real world, when your epistemology and metaphysics doesn't fit with the world as it is, when your map of reality breaks down, that's when a monster arises. And this is what my philosophy is about. This is when we see Frankenstein monsters. And this is why I've left Ayn Rand and Objectivism, and I've moved to Immanuel Kant because he's showing you, like, you need to have humility in the sense that your categorizations of the world will break apart, that your understanding of reality is not complete, it is not finished, that you cannot know things in themselves, because if you did, there would be no monsters. Your categories wouldn't break. There wouldn't be this sense. There wouldn't be. Um, so I don't know. I feel like I'm not explaining this the best, and I need to make like more videos separately on each of these topics. But I guess the point is that programs are creepy because they never decay or transform. They repeat and reset. Right? They're the kind of distorted simulations of the real reality, like a Frankenstein monster. You have this imagination, you have this idea of what reality could be like, and then when you play it out, it turns out to be this monstrosity that terrifies you. And how does this connect to Frankenstein? Well, not only because of what I already said, but Mary Shelley, in her book Frankenstein, she titled it The Modern Prometheus, or she subtitled it The Modern Prometheus. And in the book, in Atlas Shrugged, Francisco talked about how John Galt was Prometheus. And it's very, very similar to, when Prometheus stole fire from the gods, that sounds very similar to Lucifer or Satan falling from heaven. Because Lucifer is a demon and demons can use fire. But, there's a lack of humility and respect for the unknown. There's you're betraying God. You're stealing fire from the gods, and then you're punished by Zeus. And so, Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged, she frames Prometheus, right? She frames John Galt when he's when Prometheus is getting picked at by the vultures, being tortured for eternity, Ayn Rand perceives that as human beings ungrateful for the productive value that Prometheus creates, that John Galt creates. But actually, that's what happens when you discover new knowledge. That's what happens when, as a rational person, you discover that there's more that you don't know, that your categories of the world are false, that they're wrong, that you're not God, that you don't actually know all of the universe, that the universe is always surprising you. It's always showing you things that you don't know. So, and it's the same as taking a bite from the fruit in the Garden of Eden, from the tree of knowledge. When you take that bite, what's that symbolizing? It's symbolizing Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. It's symbolizing the fact that you're opening Pandora's box. Like, you're kind of exposing yourself to the monsters of the world because you're pushing up against the knowledge, the limits of your knowledge, the limits of your reason. And this is why Kant is so important and why Kant connects so well, because Kant has these amazing quotes on the Sublime, right? When you come up with a monster, when your categories break, Kant says that it's like a terror without danger, but it's also the superiority of reason, right? So like there's this sense of like my categories are breaking, but I can see that they're breaking, and that's what he calls the Sublime. And this is why I think Kant is such a powerful thinker, and why he should be integrated with Ayn Rand. He shouldn't be seen as a demon, but it also shows why Ayn Rand demonized Kant and why she's totally missing what he's saying. With Ayn Rand, you just perceive a total lack of, where is my mouse? Can't find. Right, there's a lack of existential dread with Ayn Rand, right? There's no existentialism. And this is why Ayn Rand isn't taken seriously in the philosophical conversation, even though I think what she's saying is very important, and I think she's right about a lot of things. It's because she has this naive realism where she sees reality as a programmer writing a program. And because of that, she just sees bugs. She doesn't see the sublime. She doesn't see the monstrosity of the universe. She doesn't recognize the unknown. She doesn't gaze into the abyss. She doesn't, right? Again, there's a profound lack of existential dread or existential acknowledgement. And the only time when she really starts to recognize this is with her character Gail Wynand, because Gail Wynand is the character that unintentionally exposed Rand's existentialism without meaning to, while at the same time trying not to show it. And like, so there's a really good scene. So this is Atlas Shrugged. The Fountainhead. And this is the scene where Gail Wynand and Dominique are out in the ocean. They're on a yacht together, where I think Dominique, Gail Wynand asked to marry Dominique, and Dominique said yes. And so they're on this yacht, and they're out in the middle of the ocean. You've never felt how small you were when looking at the ocean. He laughed. Never. Nor looking at the planets, nor at mountain peaks, nor at the Grand Canyon. Why should I? When I look at the ocean, I feel the greatness of man. I think of man's magnificent capacity that created this ship to conquer all that senseless space. When I look at mountain peaks, I think of tunnels and dynamite. When I look at planets, I think of airplanes. Yes, and that particular sense of sacred rapture men say they experience in contemplating nature. I've never received it from nature, only from, she stopped. From what? Buildings, she whispered. Skyscrapers. Why didn't you want to say that? I don't know. So anyway, I think this shows, again, it shows the lack of existentialism, the lack of how small the human being is, how much this inability to see the limits of reason, this inability, right? Because Ayn Rand, she really loved heroic characters. She loves men being able to face nature and to conquer nature and to build and to create and to pursue happiness. And so when Kant comes in here and says, well, reason is limited, what does that tell you? It says that like human beings fail. Even when human beings are rational, they still fail. Human beings are small. Human beings are we're tiny little human beings on a small rocky planet in the middle of space, this gigantic. What do we know about the universe? What control do we really have? And when you read the book Frankenstein, it shows you, like Victor Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, when he wants to create this creature, to bring this creature back from the dead, right? It shows you what happens when you push up against the limits of reason and what you can't perceive. And so this is what I love about Kant when he talks about the sublime, because the sublime is what you experience when you face a monster that is that goes outside of your reason. But this scene right here in the Fountainhead, it captures the lack of sublime. It captures the lack of existentialism. It shows you how surface level Ayn Rand actually is. It shows you how she hasn't integrated Kant. It shows you how she's missing a very fundamental piece of philosophy. So yeah, Kant had much to say about the sublime, and this is why Ayn Rand at the end of the day is very rigid, dogmatic, and ideological. She's an ideologue. Her philosophy is very she answers questions instead of asking more questions. She doesn't leave things open, she closes them. She's a very closed person. Like, she closes everything. Everything is already known. Objects as we perceive them are what they are, and we can know them rationally, and that's it. So it shows you a lack of intellectualism. It shows you a lack of philosophical thinking. This is why Ayn Rand isn't taken seriously, because again, she's literally surface level. And you know, and you can see this a lot with objectivists. I mean, objectivists, they repeat themselves ad nauseum. They're very boring to listen to. Once you understand objectivism and Ayn Rand, listening to objectivists is really torturous and tedious, because they say, and this is why they're called randroids. I used to be like this. This is why they're very similar to Christians who quote the Bible, because they're very ideological. They just say the same thing over and over and over again. They don't ask new questions. They lack the mystery. When they look out into the ocean, they just think about, well, what ships can I build? They don't think, well, I'm really small. I don't really know much about the world. And I also think this is why objectivists are very, very similar to conservatives, and why Ayn Rand is often mistaken for a conservative. It's because they're very similar. I mean, I've talked to a lot of online objectivists and listened to how they talk about gay people or transgender people or people who carve up reality differently. If they don't align with the heterosexual, heteronormative, standard family unit where you need to be productive and have 2.5 children and the dog and the fence, they sound very similar to conservatives, because they have this kind of judgmental attitude, except the difference between them is that conservatives are a little bit more honest, in the sense that they just don't, like the true conservatives, like they just don't like gay people and God says so and I believe in God. They're kind of very honest with their beliefs and they just believe what they want. Objectivists conflate their biases and their views of reality as objective and rational. So they rationally say that gay people are rationally inferior or rationally they're less ideal, that that a homosexual relationship is not the best relationship. Like there's a hierarchy, right? These people are, there's a hierarchy, like heterosexual couples are the best and they were made with the right parts for each other, and they just sound like conservatives in a lot of ways. Now, they're objectivists are more open-minded. They're more open-minded to gay people and stuff, but objectivists often inherit the social norms of the culture and the times, without realizing it. So anyway. But this is where things get interesting again, is that, again, there is a striking similarity between Kant and Ayn Rand. I think it's because both of them are autistic in a sense. I think they're both on the spectrum on some level. Ayn Rand, I mean, it's so funny when you think about her Mary Sue placement character, Dagny Taggart. Dagny Taggart ran a railroad line. Someone who was, Dagny Taggart was an engineer. Dagny Taggart, likes trains. Don't you think that, I don't know, that, that famous scene where the train crashes and kills all those people because they didn't think for themselves, right? It took place on a train, and autistic people are obsessed with trains. I just think that's kind of, anyway, I feel like Ayn Rand might be on the spectrum. And then the other thing is, Kant did the same thing every single day. That famous story, or that line where people would say that Kant was so consistent on his daily walks that people would actually time their clocks to when Kant went on his walks. And that Kant only broke from his routine. I think it was because there was some kind of great battle that was taking place. And I don't know, there was only 2 instances in his whole life when he didn't go on his daily walk. And he did that for decades. And I feel like that kind of very static routine, that very autistic, again, with Ayn Rand and her naive realism, this sense of like objects are what they are and I can understand them and I can make sense of them. And then with Kant, with his obsession, not even obsession, but just doing the same thing every day, is very autistic. And then on top of it, both of these people seem very concerned with reason and rationality, right? Because I think autistic people, they like things to make sense and they want everything to be logical and organized, right? Rand and Kant both valued reason. I mean, this is why they're both, again, they're both Enlightenment thinkers at the end of the day. And I think this is why Ayn Rand is a very great philosopher, just like Kant. She just missed that fundamental thing with the metaphysics and epistemology and the whole philosophical conversation. But she's still fundamentally right in the sense that she values reason and rationality. And that the neo-Kantians afterward kind of, you know, when they started to abandon reason, that's when I think things went out of control. So going back to what Jordan Peterson said, you know, he talked about, you know, the complexity of the world and breaking the world into objects and concepts. And, you know, Jordan Peterson, as a psychologist, he said this about autistic people. Autistic people are very sensitive to this. And he talked about a woman.
Temple Grandin is a very interesting.
Yeah, Temple Grandin, where Temple Grandin, you know, she couldn't imagine concepts in her head. She could, right? She was very concrete. Autistic people are very, very concrete. And this is how it connects to the complexity of reality and dividing it into concepts. Because, and this is why Rand and Kant and their argument is so interesting, because they're very sensitive to categorical breaks when reality doesn't fit its categories. And Jordan Peterson later in the video talks about how human beings don't fit their category. You know, most things in the world, like this thermos, as I talked about earlier, this fits its category pretty well. Even when the universe is in flux and when we carve reality, this thermos is pretty much a thermos. But human beings change more and break out of their categories and identities than anything else. Human beings are very difficult to pin down. And this is why autistic people struggle socially and all of that stuff, because it's very complicated. And this is where you're required to constantly recarve the world and to recapture the world and to have a more open sense of the world, and why reason really struggles here. And being a very logical person, you struggle socially because human beings are not A is A. A human being is not, right? Like, I am not who I am as I was before. I just changed. This is why psychology is not a science, for the very reason that human beings cannot be, you know, you can't scientifically test a human being consistently, because human beings are always changing. Human beings change based on their environment. Human beings, their identities are just way too loose to be able to really say anything rational about them, in a sense. So again, this brings me again, going back to Kant's routine. Why did Kant have a routine every day? And there's probably a lot of reasons for this. It could just because Kant was kind of a sensitive person, and I think he became ill rather easily, so he tried to keep his day very consistent to keep himself safe and stuff like that. But I also feel like when you have a routine every single day and you do the same thing every single time, it's very easy to spot categorical breaks. It's very easy to spot when people break out of their categories and to recalibrate and reorient yourself. Because if you don't have a routine, and it's funny because Jordan Peterson talks a lot about routines too, but if you don't have a routine, you can't, it's kind of like you don't have an independent variable. You don't have a test group, or you know how like you have your placebo group and then your test group. You give the drug to one group of people and then you don't to another group, right? You don't have a test group. I don't know what term it is I'm looking for, but if you don't have a routine, you can't spot the differences and where things have changed. You can't really know how much your map of reality has really changed. Because if you're doing different things every single day, then when you're recarving reality, how do you know you're recarving reality and identifying things in a way that is useful and is measurable? Right? You need a dependent variable and an independent variable. You need to have an anchor and a base in connection to what you're trying to study and figure out. So I think that's why Kant was so routined, or why Kant's life can be used as a great example of how to face the monstrosities of the world and how reality changes by just like you're a lot more sensitive, and you're much more aware of the sublime and the limits of your reason and the limits of your rationality when your routine doesn't go how it's supposed to go, or when your routine deviates just a little bit. It's like, I have all of these days that are the same, but this day was different from all these other days in the sense that I met someone new today, or I ate something different today. So that really helps you capture and ground yourself in reality when you have a routine. It's like a lifeboat. It helps you face the limits of reason. So anyway, and then I already talked about that. And again, I just think it's funny. I think Kant in many ways is an objectivist hero. Kant is an Enlightenment thinker. Kant's humility is an antidote to the pride and the selfishness of like later philosophers, right? Like the same way that Rand said that all of the neo-Kantians, like how Kant kind of destroyed man's mind and it took philosophy off of the road, like it made philosophy bad. I kind of see it as like Kant was able to create the limits of reason. There were no guarantees, there were no hopes, there were no promises, no fantasies, right? Like all of the philosophers after Kant, they're giving you something. Nietzsche promised you the Superman. Hegel promised you the utopia. Marx is promising you a utopia with socialism. Kierkegaard is promising you God if you just have faith. All of these, Schopenhauer isn't promising you anything, but he's just saying, he is closing the door in the sense that life is pessimistic. There's nothing here. In this sense, Schopenhauer, I feel like, is the most realistic, but his pessimism, I think, it's kind of irrational and just, I think he's missing something by just being a pessimist at the end of the day and just saying all of these. Anyway, the point is that Kant isn't closing the door. Kant isn't. He's just putting limits on reason and not promising anything. Like reality is mysterious. You can only know so much, and that's it. While philosophers after him are kind of trying to close the door, or they're trying to promise you something, or they're trying to give you a sense of passion or whatever. While Kant is just he's kind of almost kind of boring and almost a very mature thinker in the sense like he's not giving you anything. He's just saying reason is limited, so sorry. And so I think Kant saved reason for the very fact that he wasn't inserting anything. I think he was right. I think his philosophy is the reason why we still have individual rights today, right? Because after John Locke and Hume, which were both Enlightenment thinkers, right? John Locke created property rights, or he built a foundation for property rights and that kind of thing. But he also struggled with attaching, I don't know the specifics, but like this idea of like what makes an apple and attaching the traits and the qualities to an apple. And then Hume took that even further and was skeptical, and then Kant saved it right? Instead of falling into the skepticism, Kant just said, well, there's limits. We have the phenomenal and the noumenal world. And then Kant also said human beings are ends in themselves. And I feel like Kant's duty, I maybe I need to do more philosophical research and study, but I feel like when Kant is saying to do your duty, he's basically saying that you need to act in a way, like I almost perceive it as you can't just do whatever you feel like doing. You can't just pursue your self-interest, because your self-interest is prideful and it's assuming that you know what's best. You know what's best for yourself and everybody else. That's the flaw of Hegel and Marx, in my opinion. Right? Like where I think Jordan Peterson is right. Like Marx really is satanic in the sense that he was this Luciferian intellect that had it figured all out, and then we have socialism, which is ironically, right, like you think Marx with his materialism was very grounded in reality, but it was the complete opposite, right? There was nothing logical or scientific about Marxism and socialism. It's bad. It's very, very bad economics. And so I think what Kant is saying, like when you do your duty, is like you need to think as if you need to, like you can't assume that your rationality knows what's best for you or anybody else. And you kind of need to be humble. Now, maybe that's not what his categorical imperatives are saying, but when Ayn Rand says to pursue your rational self-interest, she kind of understands this on a level like, don't do your impulses, don't pursue your whims, don't just do whatever you want. You have to be rational about it. I think Kant is saying the same thing when you do your duty. To be a rational person is, in a sense, to kind of limit your own behavior, and that you can't just do whatever you want because you feel like it, because it's not, because in a sense the world is unknowable. You can only know so much of the world, so don't act as if you're this all-powerful being. Don't act like Satan who has it all figured out. So I could be wrong about that, and I might need to really brush up on my understanding of that. But that's what I get between Kant and how Rand misunderstands Kant. And, again, this goes back to monster epistemology, which is where my philosophy comes in, is that the people we demonize tend to be very similar to us. As I said, I think Rand and Kant are very, very similar. I actually found this article on Philosophy Now by Dana Andruka. I don't know, but like there's this, this really interesting article talking about how Rand and Kant are actually very, very similar. I mean, she even has a picture, she or he, closer than you might think. And it makes sense. So when you find yourself demonizing someone, and it just goes back to what I find interesting, is like they are the pathway forward. They are the doorway forward. If you find yourself disagreeing with someone or hating someone, or if you see them as the villain, they're probably holding knowledge and information that you need to integrate to make yourself a better philosopher. I think, I feel like a lot of what my philosophy right now, what I'm doing, like my monster epistemology, is taking where Rand left off and actually integrating Kant, doing what Rand should have done. I think that's what my philosophy, it sounds very arrogant and not very humble, but I do feel like if Rand took Kant seriously, I think she would be saying what I'm saying right now. I think if Rand was open to Kant, if Rand actually took the time to read his arguments or to understand what he was saying, and if she wanted to be taken seriously philosophically, and if objectivists really wanted to change the world, because I feel like objectivists are in their la-la land. Listen to objectivists online, and they're so boring to listen to. They're very surface level. They're often very dull and they don't ask true philosophical questions, and I think this is why Ayn Rand is laughed at or ignored. It's because she never really engaged with Kant, and that's what she should have done. And you see this with a lot of people. You know, when you scapegoat or demonize someone, it's a sign that in itself, if you want to be a rational person, right? Because this is something that when I was an objectivist, I found myself really kind of like, how do I know if I'm actually being rational? How do I know if I'm being irrational? Well, what if I'm missing something? Why is it that when I look at other objectivists, they seem very average? I went to an objectivist standard conference and I talked to a lot of online objectivists. And one thing that I discovered is that these people were, again, they were very average and they had a lot of flaws. They had a lot of biases. A lot of their perception of the world felt very irrational a lot of the time. It felt very much like they were conflating rationality with their own limits of reason, which is exactly what Kant was trying to fight against. Or if you look at Schopenhauer and Hegel, can you imagine how, I mean, Schopenhauer is such a brilliant mind, and yet he demonized Hegel. And look, Hegel might have been crazy. Hegel, I mean, I don't agree with Hegel. I think his phenomenology of spirit, right? Like literally the phenomenology of spirit, like the realizing the reality of the worlds through all of these antithesis and thesis and synthesis contradictions, you know, that kind of thing. And that kind of that utopianism, I think that's fundamentally wrong. But imagine if Schopenhauer actually took the time to read Hegel, or at least took the time to really understand Hegel's arguments instead of just attacking Hegel. You know, and it's so interesting when you watch videos on that famous argument, you know, like Weltgeist and Jonas Chekhov, they have great videos about the debate or the fight between Hegel and Schopenhauer. It's kind of interesting how they both saw history, like they both approached philosophy in a very similar and fundamentally different way. Schopenhauer saw the world as this constant, endless cycle of suffering, while Hegel saw the exact opposite, where the world was going towards something higher, towards the end. And it's just really interesting how these opposites, right, like they're so opposed from each other. And it seems to me that maybe it's not that Schopenhauer's correct or that Hegel's correct, but they need to be integrated. Maybe there's something that's missing. Maybe Schopenhauer's pessimism needs to be combined with Hegel's optimism. You know, maybe that's what's really true. And if Schopenhauer would have done that, his philosophy would probably be much more powerful than Hegel's, right? Because nowadays I feel like Hegel is far more popular than Schopenhauer, and that Schopenhauer is kind of overlooked because all he did was insult Hegel. And then another example is Jordan Peterson and Foucault and Derrida. It's so funny how Jordan Peterson is often accused of being a postmodernist nowadays. And Jordan Peterson is very anti-totalitarian. And Jordan Peterson, you know, as a Christian, and if you think about Foucault and Derrida, Foucault to me seems very anti-totalitarian. Foucault is about looking at power for what it is and being very concerned about that. But Jordan Peterson just dismisses it. And it's like, I feel like Foucault and Jordan Peterson are actually in agreement, right? That they should be skeptical of power, right? Like why, or like when Derrida talks about hauntology and his deference, to me, right? Like when Derrida comes up with hauntology and the specters, that to me sounds very similar to God and the Holy Ghost. Like Derrida, if anything, made me start to think from a Christian perspective, and it validates Christianity again. Like it's so strange. Like Jordan Peterson is this Christian that's very skeptical of power, and yet I feel like Foucault and Derrida are exactly the kinds of people who would back him up or could be used to defend his views. That like Derrida's deference is exactly the Holy Ghost that Jordan Peterson is talking about. That Foucault's boiling everything down to power is exactly the kind of thing that Jordan Peterson is fighting against with totalitarianism. You know, like, I don't know. It's and how Foucault what he said about the panopticon connects very much to the Eye of Sauron in Lord of the Rings. There's I'm just saying, like, when people disagree with each other, or if you see someone really demonizing someone, there's a really strong connection between them that they need to integrate, that they are missing something. Anyway, so to finish off the video, I think Ayn Rand is a really great philosopher. It's not like I've totally abandoned Ayn Rand. I think Ayn Rand, even though she missed this fundamental piece that Kant was talking about, I still think she's right about a lot of things. Like, okay, reality is in flux, and A is A, but just because reality is in flux does not mean like I wrote it. Yes, we are in flux, but how much of a flux are we in? Sure, our identities are changing and transforming, but when we carve up reality, are our carvations really that wrong that Rand's philosophy doesn't work? So it's like, I still like A equals A in the sense, like, yeah, it does. Most of the time it does. Most of the time we can get away with it. That when we carve up reality, science really does work, because objects that we define in the world, the categories don't always break. They're pretty consistent. They're very consistent. They're consistent at least within our timeline. That, again, the only time categories really break is when we see monsters. As I would argue, monsters arise when we come up with when we push up against the limits of reason. But how often do we actually see monsters? Monsters are on the outside. Monsters are on the outskirts. They're not at the center, So a lot of the time you're not going to see a monster unless you're like Prometheus and you're discovering all this new knowledge and creating all this new stuff. But a lot of the time you aren't. And again, it kind of goes back to Kant and his routine, where he did the same thing every day. It's like, how many monsters are you going to run into if you keep doing the same thing every day? Probably not very many. And if you do run into a monster, it's going to be very easy to integrate and to understand in comparison to everything else that you already know. So anyway, and what's really funny is, like, Ayn Rand demonized Kant, right? But so many people demonize Ayn Rand. So many people don't understand Ayn Rand. So many people don't want to understand Ayn Rand. A philosophy graduate that I did talk to online on Discord a long time ago, who was very similar in the sense that he pointed out, like the other guy, that objectivists saw that objectivist metaphysics is like freezing reality in time and just taking that for what reality is. This guy, he talked about how Hume led to Kant and how Kant basically disproved metaphysics. But I denied it because I just didn't want to believe that. But that same graduate in philosophy, he didn't really care to understand about philosophy. About Ayn Rand. He didn't care to really understand where Ayn Rand was coming from. And he adopted many of the the stupid self-sacrifice nonsense that most people believe today from Christianity. Like, Christianity has turned into this kind of, that Nietzsche makes a very good criticism of, this weak kind of compassionate resentment kind of morality where you make sacrifices, where no one really pursues their self-interest. No one really does what makes them happy. They think that to be good means to be not happy. That philosophy graduate, his ethics was very similar to that. His ethics was very much about, like, we need to help people. We need to make the world a better place by giving stuff up, by paying higher taxes, when it's the complete opposite, that actually capitalism and rational self-interest is what makes the world a better place for the most part. Obviously, capitalism has its flaws, but it's very interesting how, like, this guy did not understand anything that Ayn Rand was saying. So, and so many people make that argument that Ayn Rand died on welfare, and It took me a long time to meet someone who said that objectivist metaphysics was like freezing reality in time. You never actually hear that. Like, the best argument against Ayn Rand's philosophy is the fact that her metaphysics freezes reality in time. No one says that on the internet. No one actually talks about that. No one points that out. And I think it's because most people don't care about philosophy that deeply. Most people are not that engaged in Ayn Rand's philosophy. You know, a lot of them resort to these kind of arguments like she died on welfare. It's because they don't really understand Ayn Rand. They don't really understand philosophy. They don't get to the core of the issue. And this is why I'm making this video, is like, it's just fascinating to me. Like, the debate, the different sides, the contrast between Rand and Kant is fascinating and probably one of the most important arguments in philosophical history, at least in my opinion. Because even though Ayn Rand has this naive realism, she does bring back Aristotle. She does bring back this sense of like sanity. She brings back the Enlightenment in a lot of ways. Like, after Kant, the Enlightenment with Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and these, like, and Hegel, these are not Enlightenment thinkers. These are anti-Enlightenment thinkers. I think Ayn Rand in many ways is kind of like saying, okay, we need to go back. Like forget what Kant said. We just need to go back to like these ideas of rationality, you know? So yeah, that's it. That's all I wanted to say for this video. Really rambly, kind of all over the place. I wanted this video to be a lot better, but I don't know. Sometimes you just have to make videos even if you kind of go all over the place. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I'll see you later.